So, does someone give me a signal when I'm supposed to start? Okay. Okay. I was able to catch everything though when we watched it. Um, no, we watched it afterwards. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Good morning. Those of you who are here, those who are also joining us via the live stream, and even those who will be joining us later on via YouTube. My name is Brent Eelman. If you're a Dutchman, you would say Eelman. And I do share that characteristic with Andy de Jong. Both of us come from a Dutch Calvinistic background. He is from, I think, the CRC, and I grew up in the RCA. My father was a professor at New Brunswick Seminary, and so I grew up on Rutgers University campus, that team which laid down its life for Ohio State this past weekend. Just a word about me. I recently moved to Colorado in the beginning of June. My wife joined the church in September, 3 weeks ago, so we're relatively new. I am a retired Presbyterian clergy person, having served actively for 41 years, then retiring. I'm in my third retirement right now, okay? The first retirement, I did an interim pastorate in Ohio. The second retirement, I was an interim executive presbyter in Pennsylvania. And COVID hit, and I finally decided that I would be fully retired and enjoy a pew next to Karen, my wife, which, very interestingly, for 41 years, we have not sat together in church. And now we get to sit together in church. I thought it'd be fun to share a hymnal with her, but having different heights and singing different parts, and she sings awfully loud, and I don't, and she was complaining about that. Anyway, that's a little bit of a background about me. Most recently, I served a church in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and retired from there. I have a quick question, just to start things off here, and this is just a show of hands. How many of you are an older sibling? Okay, so you're an older sibling. How many of you are a younger sibling? How many of you are both? Yeah, I'm a middle child. I have an older brother and a younger brother and a younger sister. So, in their time. Well, today we're going to be talking about the older brother, and thinking about being an older sibling or having an older sibling. What are some of the characteristics or stereotypes, okay, that we often associate with older siblings, older brothers, older sisters? Any characteristics? And we have our mic person coming around. Go ahead. Yes. Responsible. Older brothers and sisters are responsible. Okay, others? Other characteristics? Yes?
Achievers.
Achievers, high achievers, okay? Other characteristics that we have of older brothers and sisters? Others? Can we think of some? Okay, well, if they come to you during our time, let's think of it. Today we're going to be talking about the older brother. And we've kind of identified him in the painting as, this gentleman. But I went back and looked over 40-some years of sermons that I've preached, and I discovered that I've preached about 5 or 6 times on this parable. And I will just say that 4 or 5 of those times, it was very controversial. Like, usually you do like comments after church if you're a minister, comments that are thoughtful, and, usually it's like, good sermon, pastor, I'll see you next week. But, these usually got one like, I don't quite agree with you, Dr. Eelman, and it went down from there. But here's some of the topics, the titles of it. The first one was the parable of the older brother. I preached that sermon once. The saga of the older sibling. Okay, I got a little onomatopoeia going there. And then, this is the one that really got into people's craw, especially on Father's Day. But I called it the foolish father. And in many cases, we can make that case. The third one was, the next one was the dysfunctional family. I preached it as that, the dysfunctional family. That's when that word was really out there in the 90s, early aughts. And then probably the theme that runs through all of them is it's not fair. And when I think I've been most effective about preaching this sermon, it has been emphasizing the lack of fairness that is within this whole parable. And if you look at the parables in general, they really aren't fair. The younger brother gets the party. The older brother, who's faithful, what does he get? Okay, if we take this drama and we work on it correctly and understand it correctly, we begin to feel that maybe he's got a case that can be made for him. I think that when we talk about this parable, we need to see it, primarily as a family narrative. It is about families. And so those of you that are older siblings, younger siblings, or middle siblings, think about your own family within this parable. Think about who you are there, and the drama that takes place within a family itself. The Bible is full of family dramas and family narratives. Jesus is listeners to this parable, and those of us who listen to it as it's being read and preached from should immediately think of other family narratives. Now, little biblical test here. Can you think of some famous siblings in the Old Testament who provided lots of drama? Cain and Abel. Okay, good one. Okay. A man, Adam, had two sons, Cain and Abel. Okay. Another set of siblings. Jacob and Esau. And that one works really great with this parable. A man had two sons, Jacob and Esau, twins. Although one was older than the other, right? Okay. Which is very interesting to be emphasized. Other brothers or sisters. Can we think of some sisters? Jacob and Esau should suggest some sisters. Rachel and Leah. And who's the older? Leah. And who's the younger? Rachel. Who's the favored one? Rachel. Okay. Very interesting. Others that we have. Siblings. With sibling rivalry. Book of Genesis is full of them. Joseph and his older brothers. Okay, Joseph and the coat. Okay, family drama and stuff. Shem and Ham. Okay, Noah's sons. How about this one? Lot's daughters. Okay, once again in Genesis. And then if we move to Exodus, we have Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. Okay, once siblings and sibling drama. Who? David and his older brothers, and David's the ruddy one off in the field, Dad Jesse forgets about him. Oh yeah, I got one more. I guess those were the days of big families, right? But David is young, one of the youngest, and is once again favored. It's very interesting in the Old Testament how countercultural the stories of the Old Testament are. The culture favors the older sibling always. The older sibling always inherits, gets the best, is taken care of. But within the biblical narrative, often it is the younger sibling, and often a troublesome younger sibling, who is raised up. If you even look at the biblical genealogies that begin the Gospels, it is often, it's fascinating to see whether the older or the younger sibling, where they are in the birth order of things. So when Jesus, stood in front of an audience, and who's his audience? Who is he talking to? for this parable? Pharisees, scribes and Pharisees, and these are to be a Pharisee means that you really toe the line. Oftentimes, we think of Pharisees as really kind of the bad people of the New Testament, and the ones that gave Jesus the most trouble. And yet Jesus had, quite a bit in common with the Pharisees. He even enjoyed table fellowship with them. He was able to eat and drink with them. They were the ones who actually sacrificed for their faith. Very interesting. Pharisaism is the foundation of modern rabbinic Judaism, but that's another story which we can go off in. But when Jesus' listeners heard him say a man had two sons, immediately their minds, especially if they're Pharisees, would have gone to the Old Testament, the only Bible that they had at that time, and would have thought of the different cases of fathers and sons and how those narratives played out. When I was in grad school, this was back in the 90s, I took a course on that included the parables, but we were talking about the drama of it, and one person was explaining the tale of the parables, and he said, well, it's kind of like J.R. and remember Dallas? Okay, a man had two sons, and the teacher just lit up and said, you're right. It captures the drama of it. That's what we need to think of when we see this parable, because then we immediately begin a process of identification. So the painting itself, I want to call your attention. What's the title of the painting? That Rembrandt had. Okay, it's the return of the prodigal son, right? The prodigal son. Now, here's a rhetorical question, and but I'll let you answer it if you have it. Why is the parable called the prodigal son? Why do we call this parable the prodigal son? And I think that's the first question that comes up as we read the chapters about the older brother. Why do we call the parable the prodigal son? Okay, let me, the earliest reference to this parable that I could find biblically, historically, was from Irenaeus, and he called it the parable of the two sons. Okay, it was the parable of the two sons. And then, I looked, I thought, usually you jump, to Tertullian, and most of the references in the first 3 centuries are the parable of the two sons. And yet, here now, most of us learned, did anyone learn this as anything different than the parable of the prodigal son? I didn't. It was always why did we focus on the parable of the prodigal son? Probably came into, it became common during the, after the 3rd and 4th century, and the parables were named. And incidentally, Jesus only named one parable. I think it was the wheat and the tares, but all the other parables we've named. It was after the church became established that they started calling this the parable of the prodigal son. Why do you think that was? Why all of a sudden do we forget about this guy and put our attention over here? And here, on the painting, Rembrandt gives them almost equal billing. This is not, but Rembrandt doesn't put the prodigal son out in front. He's off to the side, almost balanced with the brother. Why do we call it? Why do we call it that? I'll suggest an answer. Go ahead.
Jesus came to save sinners, and the younger son was sinner in spades, and yet he came to his senses, returned to his father, and was embraced and forgiven.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so part the whole idea of Christ coming to save someone. Go ahead.
Well, it seems to me the point of the story was that the father was like God and always forgiving, And so the older son didn't have anything to do with it, with the son going out and
Okay.
coming back, and the father with the open arms. And so that was the point of the story, the good parts and the forgiving parts, and, and not the older son getting his feelings hurt.
That was the good part. Okay, so in many ways, we're being led into the most uncomfortable part of this story when we were talking about the older brother. Part of it, I think, is what occurred was really kind of a massive case of projection. The church was established. It started naming the parables, and didn't even think of itself as the older brother. But, woe to those prodigals. But, we've got to welcome them back if they decide to come back. And so we have that dynamic going on. Incidentally, and I appreciate you bringing up, that God is, the Father's like God. And so, that's the allegorical dimension of this parable. And in the early church, allegory was often used to understand the parable, that, the Father acts like God, and the Son acts like, the Pharisees. The older son is like the Pharisees, and the younger son is like, all those horrible people that Jesus is associated with, and he welcomes them home. And that there is a legitimacy to understanding the parable that way. But I would also say that sticking just with an allegorical interpretation misses a lot of the drama of the story itself, and the way it can draw us into it, and that's what Rembrandt does with this. He moves us into a very, very uncomfortable place with the older brother, and we start. He himself sees himself there. The other thing is that why it might be called the parable of the prodigal is because it's with two other parables, okay? Lost sheep, lost coin, lost son, okay? What Rembrandt is suggesting to us is that there are two lost sons here. And that's the, some scholars suggest that we might want to understand this parable in terms of another parable of Luke, which is in Luke 18. And I'm going to just read it to you. It's called the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. Are you familiar with this one? Okay, Jesus also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves and that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. Got the drama going? Two men went up to the temple to pray. One a Pharisee, okay, and remember he's talking to Pharisees, and the other a tax collector. And the Pharisee, standing by himself, was praying thus, "Oh God, I thank you that I'm not like these other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, or even like this tax collector." We had a wonderful sermon on prayer this morning, and I didn't hear that prayer. As we were listening to the sermon. And the Pharisee goes on, "I fast twice a week. I give 1/10 of all my income." Okay, I am really good. Okay, but the tax collector standing far off would not even look up to heaven. Okay, look at that, where they're looking. Look at where they're looking. But was beating his breast and saying, "God, be merciful to me, a sinner." Okay, and then Jesus makes a comment. "I tell you, this man went down to his home justified rather than the others. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all who humble themselves will be exalted." When we see it in terms of that parable, or that that other parable, we suddenly put the light, and it's interesting, Rembrandt's use of light. The light falls on the Father, the Son, but also on the older brother. And this is where the focus of these two chapters that we're talking about today is. It's on this older brother. And so we're going to be looking at him and some of the characteristics that he embodied. What are some of those characteristics? Resentful. In fact, that's the big one, isn't it? He's resentful. Other characteristics that he embodies? Okay, let's put her on mic. She's offering something really important.
I thought he was a rule follower. There was something there that he felt somebody fell out from.
Uh-huh.
And there's rules that he's been following all along.
He's a rule follower. Okay, in other words, he's a Presbyterian, right? Come on, we wear our masks, we get our shots. Let's, he's a rule follower, okay? Yes. Well, let's get the mic up here, okay?
I think he is, of course, obedient and all of that. But I was struck by this picture, and I don't think it was addressed in this discussion, that he seems to be up on 2 steps above everybody else.
Wow, okay, I didn't notice that.
And so I'm trying to think, even though did Rembrandt mean to put him in a more powerful position? And yet he is solemn. He is looking, but he's very, very strong in that character. He's almost larger than everybody else in there, and he's on 2 steps higher.
Yep.
And so I was trying to think, what is the meaning behind that? Did Rembrandt mean to show him as more honored, because he had been the one who was had done everything for his father, had been responsible, reliable, etc. And so he was showing that, and yet seeing him also in a kind of subdued look and such. So anyway, that was my kind of looking at, and I'm not sure I know the answer, but I was aware of that.
It's very interesting. He's, the posture here, he's erect.
Yes.
He's up 2 steps. And he's also looking down.
Exactly. And so that's, in a way, those are 2 contradictory things in terms of he looks strong and erect, but he's also looking down. So I see those a little bit as having a double meaning, I guess you'd say.
Okay, that's good. Other characteristics that we see in the older brother. Yes, over here. And then over there.
I saw that the older son did not have his father let him celebrate, even with the least of a part of a lamb or a mutton or something like that. And yet the father said, but we have to celebrate the prodigal has come home. Yeah. Join me in celebrating your brother who is lost and now is home.
So and he's joyless. Okay, I mean, can you imagine him laughing and having a good time? Okay, go ahead. Yes.
So the word that came to mind for me when Carol was talking was uppity.
Uppity?
Yeah. And he is kind of distant from the scene in the story. There's a party being thrown and he refuses to come to the party, right? So he's missing out.
Yeah. For some reason, as you were saying that, it reminded me, and I'm just associating with communion this morning, but within the church I grew up with, I can remember the minister intoning the words as we celebrated the Lord's Supper. And as I would look around, no one was, had a very joyful face on when I was a kid, at least in the Dutch church I grew up in. This is the joyful feast of the people of God. And I figured that I had to learn to get a church face. If I was ever going to be a Presbyterian, I had to get that church face. And it seems he's got it. Rembrandt, puts that face on him. Anyway, made that association. Other things that we find: judgmental, joyless, resentful. Yes. Self-pitying. Okay, yeah. So, and how does Rembrandt, portray these characteristics? We mentioned up the steps, looking down, other ways that, you know, Rembrandt is portraying these characteristics in the older brother. Yes?
He's very self-contained, and as opposed to the father and the younger son, in this very intimate embrace.
Okay, yeah. And part of, you know, we see that self-containment, like the father has his open, and look where his hands are. I'm not touching you. Okay, yeah. Other ways that that's shown.
Well, there's 100% opposite in dress and temperament and everything.
Mm-hmm.
So he's really coming down pretty strong in that respect.
Okay, the dress and the, you know, yeah. And, you know, I go back to, you know, just how straight he is and you know, perfect posture, you know, is there.
I remember as a young person reading this parable, and when it goes through and tells the story of the prodigal son, it's like, okay, yeah, I get it, and now it's done.
Mm-hmm.
And then it keeps going, and I can never figure out why. That other part seems like an addendum or something. And and now it makes it really central to the story.
Mm-hmm.
When just first impressions of it, it seems like something that was tagged on that was unnecessary.
Oh, you mean about the older brother? Yeah, okay, you know, the son comes home and the story ends. And I think that's where most of us would like it to end. But then when we throw that older brother in, you know, that's when it gets gooey, because, you know, at least that's when some of us begin to see ourselves a little bit more. We, you know, and you know, I think that, you know, Nouwen wants us to identify with each person in this eventually.
And Nouwen makes a strong point, which I don't know that I'd ever gotten, that you don't know what happens to the elder son. It's not, that story doesn't get resolved.
And this is why parables are wonderful. Okay, and you know, and they're just a preacher's delight. They really are, because you can take off on them in any way you want. You know, I've heard sermons, and some pretty good sermons, in fact, on, well, what happened to the older brother? Did he join the party, or does he stay there on the upper step? You know, what happened to the younger son? Did he run off again? Okay, and you know, and if he runs off again, does he get to be welcomed back home? You know, all of those parts. It's so open-ended, and you know, once again, you're allowed, I think, to enter into that parable yourself. You know, and you can begin to play with the story, and when you enter into that story, it even becomes more powerful in its hearing. And Jesus invites us to do that. Yes.
The first time I remember thinking about the older son was this a program by Chuck Swindoll, which was Insight for Living. It was a you know, through Moody Bible Institute, you know, their radio program, and I realized that the older son was just as much an important part of this story as the younger son. So you know, when you realize that the older son is a little peaked about, you know, not getting his due, you realize he was keeping score all of his life, and you think of their early days when they were just kids, you know, hanging out, and the older son was learning his role and the younger son was learning his role. They probably had some doozies, because I have 3 brothers that we did a lot of fighting when we were kids and stuff, and some of it, you know, stuck. So I think that the older son, you know, like I said, he was keeping score, you know, all of his life, and so now he realizes that, you know, he's being slighted here, or at least that's how he takes it, and I think that's kind of part of it.
Yeah, I love the illustration. He was keeping score. And you know, oftentimes we keep score. You know, jokingly in our house, we keep score over who empties the dishwasher. And I'm down 4 now, right? Okay, yeah. So, and right now I've been doing most of the cooking since retiring, and Karen says, if we live 15 more years, I'll catch up. Other ways that Rembrandt captures it. The second question of that is, how does Rembrandt show that the older brother is lost? Okay, there we are. How does he show that he's lost? And the expression that he uses, in the book is lost in resentment. Okay, which are anger, envy, judgment, condemnation, bitterness, and jealousy. How does he show that? Well, I know one thing. I'm never going to stand in church like this again. Yes, go. Up here. Let's wait for the mic to get up.
This older brother has a very stern look on his face.
Mm-hmm.
It's very, like, there's not even a hint of a smile there. There's not even a hint of acceptance or forgiveness and he is on two steps and he's looking down. To me, that shows that Rembrandt showed his resentment and anger and, by him looking down also.
Does he look like he wants to get out of there?
Yeah.
Yeah. Like really, it's an uncomfortable pose, isn't it?
And this is the most uncomfortable part of the story for me.
Okay.
Is I don't know if that older brother eventually forgave and came to the party. That's uncomfortable for me.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't tell by that look that he did. As a matter of fact, maybe he still wanted to be in his own little world,
Yeah. I appreciate your sharing that, yes.
One other thing that I wonder about is the stick or the cane. Why? Does that say, okay, it's kind of another barrier between what's happening and him? I mean, if does it mean power? So that's another thought, what does this stick or cane or whatever you want to call it reflect in terms of the meaning? But it seems to me like it's another piece of a barrier, like I'm not going to step forward and be a part of this. I'm strong, I'm keeping my deal, and so that's my thought.
Yeah. I was just looking at this, the painting again, and drawn to the bare feet of the brother, the prodigal, and everything's covered. Okay, there's no vulnerability there. Bare feet are extremely vulnerable, within some spiritual traditions, the soul enters through the foot. The sole of the foot. Getting a little Jungian there for those of you that want to go down that road, but it's there. Yes.
Brought up today about the executive function.
Yes.
And meditation, and the father said to the older son, "What I have is yours."
Yeah.
But here, your younger son, your younger brother, has come back.
Mm-hmm.
We need to share or meditate with your younger son who's come back.
Mm-hmm.
You can see he's wasted. We need to welcome him home.
Mm-hmm.
Now, come, join the party.
Okay. There's an interesting part in the book where Nouwen talks about Rembrandt himself and Rembrandt's life, and he raised the question: how was Rembrandt like the older brother, okay? Part of what Nouwen is saying is that Rembrandt saw within his own life all three of these characters. But how is Rembrandt like the older brother? Yes?
He was apparently not real easy to get along with.
He was not easy, especially after
Kind of
his
cocky.
wife died, yeah.
Kind of cocky, yeah.
Yeah. He was like the younger brother early on in his career, apparently. I mean, you see some of the paintings early on, the self-portraits. You go, whoa! Rembrandt lived a pretty wild life there in Amsterdam. But he goes in one particular story about Rembrandt's later life, where he comes off as the older brother. Remember? It's his mistress, Gerta. She just wants a pension from him, and he denies her. He denies the brother, and this is an awful, terrible chapter. I've always kind of revered Rembrandt, and when I read that, I went ooh, and then you're reminded. Each of us has that capability and, part of that story within us. So, Rembrandt also could identify with the older brother. I'm concerned about time. I'm supposed to end at 11. Okay. Let's say we're in good question. I'm going to read to you two things. Read one part of a sermon to you, and then I'd like to read a tweet of all things, and then share a personal story, and leave you with a couple rhetorical questions to think about. The sermon, have any of you heard of Paul Tillich? Paul Tillich, he, German theologian, came to America in the 30s, taught at Union Theological Seminary, but horrible, thick German accent. My father studied with him. He said, he wished he talked in German. He could understand him better. But he was a brilliant preacher. His theology sometimes leaves me a little cold, but he was a brilliant preacher. And he preached this sermon, I think, at Riverside Church. I'm going to read one paragraph from it because it's related to this story, but it brings home the older brother to us in the life of the church. And Tillich preached, "Why do Christians turn away from their righteous pastors? Why do people turn away from righteous neighborhoods? Why do many turn away from righteous Christianity and from the Jesus it paints and the God it proclaims? And why do they turn to those who are not considered to be the righteous ones? Often, certainly, it is because they want to escape judgment. But more often it is because they seek a love which is rooted in forgiveness. And this the righteous cannot give. Many of those to whom they turn cannot give it either. Jesus gave it to the woman who was utterly unacceptable. The church would be more like the church of Jesus than it is now if it did the same. If it joined Jesus and not Simon, or if it joined the Father and not the older son, in its encounter with those who are rightly judged unacceptable. Each of us who strives for righteousness would be more Christian if more were forgiven him, if he loved more, and if he could better resist the temptation to present himself as acceptable to God by his own righteousness. Powerful quote. It's one of my favorites from the sermons of Tillich. But he captures there, and he brings it, from an individual level to a corporate level. Are we the church of the older brother? It was kind of funny. When we sat down in church today, the woman behind us, and she did this so gracefully. I love it. She says, "Usually I sit there, you know." I said, "Oh, we're sorry." And she said, "No, it's okay." And I felt really honored to be in her seat. Oftentimes, are we, this is my church, are you welcome here? She was very welcoming, and the church here has been really welcoming. So that's the first one I want to read, to you, to bring this painting home. Second one, was, I must admit that I read Twitter, okay? I don't tweet too often, but I follow a bunch of people on Twitter. I came across this tweet this week, okay? And it was in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis. In the past 2 weeks, mandatory vaccines have come into place for many people in the workplace. Oh boy, I knew I would do this before the day was out. Can you still hear me? Okay. But anyway, I'm going to hold this here, okay? So we'll do one-handed gestures now. This was written by someone who was in HR in a large company, and he just tweeted, "I'm really angry. I've had a dozen of my employees who had to be laid off because they refused to get the vaccine. Okay. Yesterday, 3 of them contacted me and said they decided to go out and get it, and now they wanted to come back. I'm really angry with them. Should I let them back?" I share that with you as, once again, we have that justification. And, my spouse, my wife will tell you about, I feel like the older brother a lot of times about mask wearing in the stores and in the restaurants, and about, the vaccine. Okay? The judgment is there. And, that's my confession. I vaxxed twice. I wear my bracelet that shows that I'm vaxxed, and I think everyone should be. Okay? Older brother stuff coming out. And, the older brother has a point, doesn't he? Okay? So that's that one. And then And I'm going to close with a personal story. And okay, there we are. And then 2 rhetorical questions. My personal story is this. I am both an older son and a younger son, okay? It's very interesting. My older brother, Bruce, who's 5 years older than I am, has many of the characteristics of, being, practical, down to earth, follows the rules. He's just he's on the building committee of his church, okay, and he does a good job. And my younger brother is just like him. It's very interesting. Okay, and then there's Brent, but the story goes this way, and it's a family story. And it became the defining story in our family about the relationship between my older brother and me. We had a summer home in a place called Chautauqua, New York, right on the lake. Some of you perhaps have been to Chautauqua. I grew up there. I had the fortune to be there. But my brother, I was about, I think, 8 or 9 years old. He was about 12 or 13. And he had a brand new red bathing suit. Okay, and it was hanging on the line outside the house. I just looked at it and thought, that's the nicest bathing suit. And so I grabbed it off the line, went into the bedroom, put it on, and walked into the living room where my father and my brother were sitting. And I was sporting the red bathing suit, which immediately got him angry, like unbelievably angry. Like, how dare you wear my red bathing suit? And so he came charging after me. I went running as fast as I could out into the lake. We had lakefront cottage, and stood in the lake because I had his bathing suit on. He didn't. He couldn't get out there, and just went. He was there, and I was well beyond reach, throwing rocks at me, little pebbles at me. And my father just observed all this. Would often, as preachers often do, elaborate on the story about how my legs were pumping like pistons as I ran out, and he never saw me run so fast, and the anger of my older brother. But it just kept being a repeated story in our family, and it became a defining story of our relationship. It really is kind of the older brother, younger son, naughty younger son and older brother. This story kind of hung out there. We went off to college, went our separate ways. I went to different places in the country. He went into the Navy and then took a job. And truthfully, if we saw each other once every 2 or 3 years, it would have been something. Okay, and even then, it was just a warm, cordial, formal relationship of brothers. And it was 30 years ago, my 40th birthday. Karen decided that was the birthday to celebrate, and she invited my siblings with their families up to our place we lived in northern New York. And there was all kinds of gag gifts that they had. I got the cane, okay, which someplace, I guess, and a few other things. And then it was opening a present for my older brother, and it was a red bathing suit. Okay, I tell you the story because, the next chapter is, how does the older brother come home? Okay, how does the older brother become the father? Okay, how do we become the father? My older brother figured it out. Okay, and we tell the story now with that ending. It's still a family story for us, but my wife will tell you, my older brother and I are close now. We were never close. We do things together. We Zoom call each other for 40 minutes every Friday night. We were planning to go to the Netherlands, this past summer and the summer before that, but it became close. And so one of the questions that now one continues to ask is, how do we become like the Father? And my older brother figured it out, and the story behind that is grace. That is what it takes, and resentfulness, all those types of things, cannot be captured in grace. So I'm going to leave you now with 2 questions, okay, if I have time. And the first one is, when we think about being lost in resentment, anger, envy, judgment, condemnation, bitterness, and jealousy, do you identify with any of these? That's the first question, and that's a rhetorical question. And the second rhetorical question I'm going to leave you with is, and does our national, social climate and our national politics, do they show the characteristics of a society that is lost in resentment? And if so, how do we come home? And those are the questions I want to leave you with. I do want to thank you for being, a gracious group and welcoming me, a prodigal who has managed to come to Colorado and ended up here. I do feel enfolded in your love and thanks. Let us close this time with prayer. Okay. Gracious and loving God, we are indeed often lost souls, living amongst people who are often lost. And so as we come to realize who we are, what we have done, the positions that we have taken, we pray that we may find in your arms and in the arms of others the grace that welcomes us and says, come home, sinner, come home. We pray in the name of one who welcomes us, Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. Oh, here we are. Yeah. Chapter 6 for people at home.
Chapter 6.